Athens, December 1944. The wind swept through empty streets, carrying dust over rubble and skeletal bodies that seemed more shadow than flesh. The German occupation had ended, but liberation brought no celebration. The city stood silent, haunted by the ghost of the Great Famine that had devoured 300,000 souls between 1941 and 1942. Those who survived walked with hollow eyes, their faces marked by a hunger so profound it had become part of their identity. Among them, 9-year-old Eleni Papadopoulos moved like a whisper through the ruins. She had learned to walk quietly during the occupation, when any sound could mean death, when bread was a memory and survival meant eating orange peels boiled with leaves. Her mother kept a notebook filled with recipes they could no longer make, each written line a prayer for a future that seemed impossible. The notebook became their secret resistance, a way to remember they were once human, once capable of joy around a table laden with food. When the first convoy of Allied trucks appeared on the horizon, Eleni watched from a broken window. No cheers erupted, no flags waved. The survivors had learned that hope was dangerous, that expectations led only to deeper wounds. They had seen too many promises turn to ash, too many relief efforts vanish into the machinery of war. Technical Sergeant Raymond W. Cox stepped down from his jeep, boots crunching on broken glass. He had crossed the Atlantic expecting gratitude, perhaps even triumph. Instead, he found a morgue of the living. The UNRRA mission to Greece had sent him to deliver food, medicine, and reconstruction. But as he surveyed the devastated capital, Cox understood he had been sent to resurrect the dead. The medical reports told a story numbers could barely contain. Average weight of a 10-year-old child, 18 kilograms. Tuberculosis rates, catastrophic. Mental trauma, immeasurable. The famine had not simply killed bodies, it had murdered trust, hope, and the basic human capacity to believe in tomorrow. Cox's convoy carried flour, powdered milk, quinine, and condensed rations. American abundance packed into wooden crates, marked with stenciled letters that meant nothing to people who had forgotten what fullness felt like. As his team began unloading supplies, Cox noticed the civilians maintained their distance. They did not rush forward. They did not beg. They simply watched, waiting to see if this new occupation would be different from the last. An elderly man approached slowly, his coat hanging loose on a frame that had once been strong. He spoke in broken English, his voice barely above a whisper. "You bring food today, but tomorrow, next week, will you stay or will you leave us to starve again?" Cox had no answer that would satisfy. He had orders, protocols, distribution schedules mapped out by bureaucrats who had never seen a child too weak to cry. But standing in that devastated street, surrounded by the human wreckage of total war, Raymond Cox made a silent promise. Whatever the regulations said, whatever his superiors demanded, he would not let these people starve again. That night, in a requisitioned hotel room with cracked windows, Cox wrote to his wife in Pennsylvania. His hand trembled as he formed the words, "I came to deliver food, but I found a country that needed to remember what it meant to be alive." Outside, Athens slept its restless sleep, and in a ruined apartment nearby, young Eleni held her mother's recipe notebook against her chest, dreaming of bread. Yet as the city lay still, Raymond Cox knew the hard truth. At dawn, the convoy would move north, into roads that no longer existed, and choices that regulations could not answer. No map, no protocol could guide them, only the promise of food and the hope of a future that was still uncertain. The famine did not begin with violence, it began with mathematics. In April 1941, German forces occupied Greece and immediately requisitioned the country's wheat harvest. What the Axis powers did not confiscate, they exported. What they did not export, they burned. Within months, a nation that had fed itself for millennia found itself with empty granaries and closed borders. By winter, the death carts rolled through Athens every morning. Bodies lay in doorways, their faces frozen in expressions of quiet disbelief. Children with distended bellies and stick-thin limbs begged for crusts that did not exist. Mothers boiled leather shoes to create a semblance of broth. The wealthy sold family heirlooms for a handful of beans. The poor simply died. Eleni remembered the day her father disappeared. He had gone to search for food in the countryside and never returned. Her mother never spoke of him again, as if words would make the loss more real. Instead, she wrote in her notebook, carefully transcribing recipes for moussaka, spanakopita, baklava dripping with honey. Each recipe was an act of defiance, a refusal to let hunger erase who they had been. The famine claimed victims with cold efficiency. First, the very young, then the elderly, then anyone weakened by illness or despair. Doctors recorded symptoms they had only read about in medieval texts. Xerophthalmia, pellagra, kwashiorkor. The human body, stripped of sustenance, began consuming itself. Muscle disappeared. Organs failed. The mind, desperate for glucose, produced hallucinations of feasts that dissolved upon waking. Cox studied the archived photographs from 1942 with growing horror. Images of corpses stacked like cordwood outside hospitals. Bread lines that stretched for kilometers. People standing for hours only to be turned away empty-handed. A mother cradling a dead infant, too exhausted even to weep. These were not distant abstractions from history textbooks. These people were still here, still breathing, still carrying the weight of those 1,000 days. The psychological damage ran deeper than any physical wound. Survivors developed obsessive relationships with food, hoarding even small portions they could not eat. They suffered recurring nightmares of starvation, waking in panic to check that provisions remained. Trust had been obliterated. During the famine, neighbors had betrayed neighbors for a moldy potato. Friends had stolen from friends. Families had fractured under the crushing pressure of impossible choices. Eleni's family had survived through a combination of luck and strategic begging. Her mother cleaned houses for families connected to the black market, accepting payment in spoonfuls of rice. Eleni scavenged the docks where relief ships occasionally arrived, gathering scattered grains from broken sacks. They ate grass, tree bark, cats, rats, anything that could be chewed and swallowed. Now, 3 years after the worst had passed, the famine persisted as shadow. People still ate with frantic urgency, as if each meal might be their last. Children hoarded food in pockets and under beds. The collective trauma had transformed an entire generation into permanent refugees from abundance. Cox understood that his mission extended beyond logistics. Feeding Greece meant more than filling stomachs. It meant teaching people to hope again, to believe that tomorrow would bring another meal, that the future held something beyond perpetual hunger. But first, he needed to reach them, and the roads ahead were dangerous. The convoy departed Athens at dawn, a procession of 12 trucks laden with supplies and fragile hope. Cox rode in the lead jeep, studying maps that showed roads no longer passable. Bridges destroyed by retreating armies, villages that might no longer exist. Beside him sat Lieutenant James Harper, a British logistics officer who approached humanitarian work with military precision, and Dr. Nikos Monetas, a Greek physician who had survived the famine by working in underground clinics. Their destination was the mountain villages of Thessaly, regions the occupation had isolated and the liberation had forgotten. Intelligence reports suggested these communities faced complete collapse. No food had reached them in months. Disease spread unchecked. Children were dying not from bullets but from the slow erosion of neglect. The first obstacle appeared 30 kilometers outside Athens. A bridge across the Kifissos River had been demolished, its steel skeleton twisted into the water below. Cox ordered the convoy to halt while engineers assessed alternative routes. The delay cost them 4 hours and exposed a fundamental problem. Reconstruction required more than goodwill. It demanded infrastructure that no longer existed. They found a ford downstream and crossed carefully, trucks groaning under their loads. By midday, they entered territory contested by rival factions. The German withdrawal had created a power vacuum filled by competing groups, communist partisans, nationalist militias, bandits who recognized no ideology beyond survival. Each controlled different stretches of road, each demanded payment or tribute. At a narrow mountain pass, armed men emerged from the tree line. Their leader, a bearded man who called himself Kapitan Dimitris, blocked the road with his body. He spoke rapidly in Greek, his rifle pointed casually toward Cox's chest. Dr. Monetas translated, his voice tense. He asks if we come to save Greece or to control it. He says the British and Americans always bring chains hidden inside gifts. Cox stepped forward slowly, hands visible and empty. He had rehearsed this moment during the Atlantic crossing, knowing that trust could not be mandated or purchased. It had to be earned through transparency and consistency. Tell him we bring flour, milk, and medicine. Tell him we take nothing in return except the knowledge that children will eat tonight. Tell him he can search every truck, count every sack, and accompany us to witness the distribution. The translation hung in the mountain air. Capitan Dimitris studied Cox with eyes that had seen too many lies dressed as promises. Finally, he lowered his rifle and gestured for his men to step aside. But he did not smile. "He says you may pass," Manetas translated. "But he will be watching. If you betray these people, you will answer to him." The convoy continued climbing into regions where winter arrived early and lingered late. They passed villages reduced to rubble, fields left fallow because no one remained to plant them, Orthodox churches converted into makeshift morgues. At each stop, Cox saw the same pattern: initial suspicion giving way to desperate need, pride dissolving under the weight of starvation. In the village of Kalambaka, they found 60 families living in conditions medieval Europe would have recognized. Eleni's face appeared again in Cox's mind, superimposed over every child he encountered. How many had survived only to face abandonment in these forgotten mountains? That night, camped beneath stars so bright they seemed accusatory, Cox made his decision. Rules existed to create order, but sometimes order demanded breaking rules. The distribution protocols were explicit. Each village received supplies calculated by registered population, verified through municipal records that often no longer existed. Priority went to urban centers, where Allied forces maintained strategic interests. Mountain communities, isolated and politically insignificant, received allocations only after primary objectives were satisfied. Cox carried these directives in a leather folder that grew heavier each day. In Kalambaka, the official registry listed 82 inhabitants. Cox counted over 300 souls sheltering in collapsed homes and makeshift tents. Refugees from burned villages, families displaced by factional warfare, orphans wandering from place to place, none appeared in any bureaucratic ledger. According to regulations, they did not exist. According to humanity, they were dying. The village elder, a priest named Father Andreas, explained the situation with quiet desperation. His black robes hung loose on a frame reduced by months of inadequate nutrition. "They come to us because we share what little we have. But our little becomes nothing when divided among so many. We bury 3, sometimes 4 people each week, mostly children and the elderly. Always the most vulnerable first." Cox did the mathematics. His allocated supplies could sustain the registered population for 2 weeks. Distributed among the actual population, they would last 5 days. He could follow protocol and condemn 200 people to starvation, or he could violate direct orders and face court-martial. That night, while Lieutenant Harper slept, Cox opened the supply warehouse. He worked by flashlight, reorganizing crates and falsifying inventory sheets. What the official records would show as damaged goods or spoilage would actually feed families living in the margins of paperwork. Dr. Manetas discovered him an hour before dawn, standing among scattered sacks of flour like a thief caught mid-crime. "You know what this means?" the doctor asked softly. "It means children eat tomorrow," Cox replied. Manetas nodded slowly, then began helping redistribute the supplies. The confrontation arrived 3 days later. Lieutenant Harper had discovered the discrepancies during a routine audit. He found Cox supervising distribution in the village square, watching families receive rations that should not exist according to official manifests. "Those sacks were designated for Athens," Harper's voice carried across the square, sharp with betrayal and regulation. "You've exceeded authorized distribution by 40%. Do you understand the consequences?" Cox turned to face his superior, aware that every villager watched this exchange. Father Andreas stood nearby, translation unnecessary. Everyone understood when authority confronted compassion. "Fear they will die here before those supplies reach Athens," Cox said quietly. "I've seen the transportation schedules. I've calculated the delays. Mathematics doesn't lie, Lieutenant. If we follow protocol exactly, we save numbers on paper while people perish in reality. Harper's face reddened. You're not authorized to make those decisions. We have orders. We have chains of command. Without discipline, this entire mission collapses into chaos. Without flexibility, this mission becomes complicit in murder. The silence that followed felt absolute. Two philosophies stood opposed: order versus mercy, regulation versus improvisation. The comfortable distance of bureaucracy versus the immediate presence of suffering. Harper could report Cox, destroy his career, perhaps even bring criminal charges. Or he could look at the faces surrounding them and recognize that some rules deserved breaking. The lieutenant departed without another word, his jeep raising dust as it disappeared down the mountain road. Cox waited for the inevitable summons, the formal reprimand, the end of his mission. Instead, at dawn, he found something else. A small olive branch, carefully placed on the hood of his vehicle. The ancient Greek symbol of peace, gratitude, and hope. The school building in Kalambaka had served many purposes during the occupation. First, a German command post, then a field hospital for wounded partisans, finally an improvised morgue where bodies awaited burial in frozen ground. Now, under Dr. Manetis' supervision, it would return to its original purpose. Children would learn again. Cox arrived with a work crew at sunrise, carrying tools salvaged from abandoned workshops. The interior showed signs of its violent history. Bullet holes in plaster walls, bloodstains on wooden floors, shattered windows that let winter wind howl through empty classrooms. They spent 3 days cleaning, repairing, transforming trauma back into possibility. The desks had been burned for firewood during the coldest months, so Cox's team improvised. Wooden planks across stacked stones became benches. Ammunition crates turned upside down served as tables. A requisitioned chalkboard, cracked but functional, mounted on the front wall. In the courtyard, they built a kitchen using salvaged bricks and a cast-iron stove discovered in a collapsed bakery. When the doors reopened, 23 children appeared. They came hesitantly, as if expecting punishment or disappointment. Most were barefoot despite the cold, their clothes, patched and repatched, barely qualified as garments. But they carried something precious, handmade notebooks fashioned from scraps of paper, bound with string, pages waiting to be filled. Eleni stood among them. Cox recognized her immediately, though they had never met outside his imagination. She possessed that same cautious alertness he had witnessed in Athens, the vigilance of someone who had learned that survival required constant attention. Her dark eyes studied everything, calculating risks and possibilities. The first lesson began with bread. Dr. Manetis had convinced Cox that education meant more than literacy. Before children could learn letters, they needed to remember what normalcy felt like. The improvised kitchen became a classroom where flour transformed into sustenance, where yeast and water created miracles. Cox watched as the dough rose, explaining through Manetis' translation how fermentation worked, how heat changed structure, how chemistry enabled life. The children listened with an intensity that transcended hunger. They were witnessing magic, the transformation of scattered ingredients into something whole and nourishing. The first loaves emerged from the oven, their golden crusts releasing steam into the cold air. No one moved. The smell alone seemed sufficient, a sensory memory of better times. Father Andreas blessed the bread with trembling hands, his prayer brief and profound. Let us remember what it means to have enough. Each child received a portion, still warm. They ate slowly, reverently, as if consuming something sacred. Cox watched them, wondering if they had forgotten what it meant to be full, or if they had simply learned to be grateful for what was given. Afterward, Eleni approached the chalkboard. Without prompting, she drew a tree, simple lines forming trunk and branches, circles representing fruit or leaves. Cox knelt beside her, genuinely curious. What kind of tree is that? She considered the question with absolute seriousness. The tree that gives bread, he smiled, charmed by her innocent confusion. You mean wheat? Eleni shook her head slowly, her expression older than her years. No, hope. The word hung between them, profound and unanswerable. Cox understood then what he had truly been sent to deliver. Not food, not medicine, not reconstruction, something far more essential and infinitely more difficult to quantify. And outside, the olive branch still rested on his jeep. Inside, children laughed for the first time in years. The rhythm of hunger was finally yielding to the rhythm of recovery, but in the distance, the mountains loomed darkly, still silent. More was coming. More would be needed. The summons arrived on a cold January morning, delivered by military courier. Cox was ordered to return to Athens immediately to face an inquiry regarding unauthorized distribution of relief supplies. Lieutenant Harper had filed his report. The wheels of military justice, slow but inexorable, had begun turning. The journey back felt longer than the ascent into the mountains. Cox carried with him a leather satchel containing falsified inventory records, distribution logs that contradicted official allocations, and testimonies from village elders praising decisions that violated every regulation. Evidence of his guilt, documented with meticulous precision. Dr. Manetas accompanied him, insisting that someone needed to testify about conditions the bureaucrats had never witnessed. "They will judge you from comfortable offices," the doctor said. "Someone must make them see the faces behind the numbers." The inquiry convened in a requisitioned hotel overlooking Syntagma Square. 3 officers sat behind a long table, 2 British, 1 American, their uniforms pressed, their expressions neutral. They represented order, discipline, the institutional machinery that kept armies functioning and missions operational. Cox represented chaos, the dangerous notion that individual conscience could override collective command. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Technical Sergeant Cox had exceeded authorized distribution limits by 43%. He had falsified supply records. He had redirected materials designated for strategic urban centers to non-priority rural populations. His actions, however well-intentioned, constituted insubordination and misappropriation of military resources. Cox offered no defense beyond truth. He described villages where children died weekly from preventable starvation. He explained mathematical realities that official registries ignored. He spoke about Father Andreas burying infants in frozen ground, about mothers too weak to produce milk, about the moral calculus that weighed regulations against lives. "I understand I broke protocol," Cox concluded, "but I could not watch people die while supplies sat unused because paperwork declared them non-existent. If that constitutes a crime, then I am guilty." The senior British officer, Colonel Pemberton, leaned forward. His face revealed nothing. "Sergeant, do you comprehend the implications of your argument? If every soldier decided which orders to follow based on personal judgment, military structure would collapse. Discipline exists for reasons beyond bureaucratic preference." Before Cox could respond, an aide entered with urgent dispatch. The officer read it quickly, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly. He passed the paper to his colleagues, then looked directly at Cox. "We've received reports from Thessaly. The village of Kalambaka and 3 surrounding communities survived the winter at significantly higher rates than projected. Medical officers attribute this to, and I quote, unexpected availability of nutritional resources. Your unauthorized distributions, Sergeant, apparently saved approximately 200 lives." The room fell silent. Cox waited for the inevitable conclusion that saving lives through illegal means still constituted criminality, that good outcomes did not justify bad processes. Instead, Colonel Pemberton closed the file before him. "This inquiry is concluded. Sergeant Cox, you are hereby reprimanded for procedural violations and commended for operational effectiveness. A contradiction, I acknowledge, but war produces contradictions. Return to your post." The door closed behind Cox as he stepped into the cold air. The reprimand had come, but the acknowledgement was a hollow one. He had been right, but he had also broken the rules. Now, with the mission still in motion, there was no time to reflect. The trucks had to keep moving. The supplies had to keep flowing. The children still needed to eat. 30 years dissolved like morning mist. Eleni Papadopoulos, now 40 years old and a history teacher at Athens Gymnasium, walked through the entrance of the newly established Museum of the Famine. The building, once a warehouse where desperate families had queued for rations that rarely came, had been transformed into a repository of collective memory. The exhibition halls contained artifacts that testified to suffering. Ration cards marked with declining allocations, photographs of skeletal children, medical reports documenting the physiological collapse of an entire population. Each display case held fragments of a nightmare the survivors had spent decades trying to forget and simultaneously desperate to remember. Eleni moved slowly through rooms organized chronologically. The occupation, the blockade, the first deaths, the mass graves, then finally liberation and the faces of those who came to help. She recognized the uniforms before she recognized the faces. UNRRA personnel, Red Cross workers, soldiers who became saviors, not through violence, but through the simple act of feeding the starving. In the final room dedicated to international relief efforts, she found him. A photograph, slightly faded, showed a young American soldier standing beside a distribution truck. His face carried an expression she remembered perfectly, determination softened by compassion, authority tempered by humility. The caption read, Technical Sergeant Raymond W. Cox, UNRRA Mission to Greece, 1944-1946. Beside the photograph, enclosed in glass, lay a letter. Eleni leaned closer, reading words written in English, a language she had mastered during her teaching career. The letter was addressed to Margaret Cox, Pennsylvania, dated March 1945. My dearest Margaret, today something extraordinary happened. After distributing supplies in a mountain village, I watched a young girl, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, receive her portion of bread. She held it as if it were made of gold, as if it contained all the magic in the world. And then she smiled. After months of seeing only fear and exhaustion, I witnessed genuine joy. If this war has any meaning beyond the statistics of death and destruction, perhaps it exists in that single moment. Perhaps victory means seeing a child smile while holding bread. I pray we never forget how precious such simple things truly are. Eleni read the words 3 times, tears blurring the text. She remembered that day with crystalline clarity. The warmth of fresh bread in her hands, the disbelief that food could appear without cost or consequence, the moment when hope became tangible rather than abstract. From her coat pocket, she withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth, a stone, smooth and grey, approximately the size of her palm. Years ago, before leaving Kalambaka for university in Athens, she had taken this stone from the village square, where Cox's convoy had first arrived. She had carved into its surface a single word in Greek, psalmi, bread. The museum curator, noticing her intent focus, approached quietly. Eleni explained what the stone meant, why she had brought it, what she wished to do. The curator nodded with understanding that transcended institutional protocols. Eleni placed the stone carefully at the base of Cox's photograph. A museum guard would likely remove it later, cite regulations about unauthorized additions to displays, but for this moment, her offering stood as testament to a debt that could never be fully repaid. She had learned years after the war that Raymond Cox died in 1970, 5 years earlier. A heart attack, sudden and merciful. He never knew how many lives he had saved, how many children grew into adults because he chose compassion over compliance.